understood it was really a fight for racial justice. Interestingly, the fight for justice, or for racial justice, is very intimately connected with the rights, not just civil rights, but the legal rights of children in the system. And knowing that Roper v. Simmons had ended the death penalty for children, there was yet another death in prison sentence that was waiting to swallow up our children, and that is life without parole. I have so many friends who I grew up with in the system who were serving that sentence, and they looked just like us. And sadly, not long after that, many kids were being given extreme sentences. But understand, this narrative about black and brown children began even as early as the 80s and 90s. In fact, prior to that. Think about Emmett Till, think about George Stinney, think about the children who had lost their lives unjustly. And that justice only came decades later when truths were revealed on deathbeds. Think about that, you all. And so after 2005's decision, the Supreme Court stepped in yet again in 2010 in Granby, Florida, stating that no child should be given the death penalty for non-homicide related offenses. Understand, that was really just looking at an evolving standard of decency. That was about what we know now more readily is that the neuroscience speaks to the underdeveloped brain, that a child's brain is not fully formed, that we're given to impetuous risk-taking and behavior, and yet we're also very much, the peer pressure that we have to deal with is very challenging. For a child in particular, being able to navigate the emotional realities of being pressured into something, and yet living in environments that we cannot extract ourselves from. In other words, a child is very vulnerable to making poor decisions. And trust me, you all, what they would love to say is that if you're able to make a decision that can hurt someone or take someone's life, you deserve to spend the rest of your life in prison. I can tell you what it's like to grow up in prison. And so I'm going to stop there and sharing about the work, and I'm going to revisit some of that intuition and talk about what's happening here in Mississippi, which many of you know very intimately. But I can tell you that my first time involved with being touched by the laws was at the age of 6 years old, you all. And I want you all to remember what it was like for children, especially during the 80s and 90s in places like the south side of Chicago where I grew up. And back in the yards, understand, I was living in dire poverty, you all. I was a kid who woke up each day concerned not just about where I would get my next meal. Thankfully, Port Ministries was right down the street, and Salvation Army was right next door. But I was also a kid who lived in an environment that sadly contended with mental health challenges. My mother was dealing with undiagnosed and untreated schizophrenia. My brother was dealing with the same. My father was a very abusive man, unfortunately, a very dominant personality. And sadly, domestic violence was the dominant theme of my growing up. And then when my mother ran away from my father and met yet another man who was the father of my sister, he did something very horrible to my other sister. And sadly, when social services showed up and they saw the conditions in which we were living, and sadly, when the police showed up and kicked down our door and arrested my stepfather, I'll never forget a woman walking up to me and my brother and stooping down to us and saying, "Listen, I'm not here to hurt you all. I just want you all to come with me. I'm here to help you." Little did she know that what would have been helpful was not to separate me from my mother. And sadly, we ended up in a foster care system. For 2.5 years, we lived with a woman by the name, her name was Miss Betterman. When we walked into the place, I'll never forget how beautiful the furniture was. It was amazing. And I remember, laying that mentally alongside what I grew up in. And lo and behold, we had our own room. Me and my brother, we shared a room. But little did we know that, A, we would not be able to experience half of the house. The dining room and the living room was not allowed to us. We would spend most of our time in that small room with 2 bed-like fixtures and two beds and 2 closet-like fixtures where we had our belongings. And I remember swiftly and quickly how punitive she had been. The moment we made too much noise, talk about managing you all, the moment we made too much noise, too much of a mess, the moment we didn't adhere to the structure that she felt was that of a family life, we were swiftly met with I would call it abuse, which in all reality was a dominant theme, much of what I experienced growing up. But to experience that at the hands of a stranger as opposed to a parent felt overly egregious as a child. And my brother contended with mental health challenges. Understand, we didn't have toys in our room, so I will never forget one day, my brother and I, we took a lot of construction paper. I remember us on the floor playing with the construction paper, and we created a slide, a slide. And I'll never forget, we were fighting over it, like, no, I'm next, no, I'm next. And we were balling up paper, and we were just making the ball of paper roll down into, I forgot what it was, but it was like, remember, I'm a child, but I'll never forget how vividly exciting that was for us as kids who didn't have other forms of entertainment. And I remember her walking into the room upset at the mess we had made, and she had destroyed our slide, and she had whipped us. And I remember how sad we were behind that. And what stood out for me more than anything, and what I remember more vividly, honestly, was how deeply hurt we were that our slide had been taken from us. It was the only form of entertainment. It was the only a source of pride, something we created. And to experience that early on in my childhood, along with all that led up to that, and then soon to be released from the foster care system, my mother convinced him she had a place of her own when she really didn't. Understand, my life was inching its way towards the justice system. And at 9 years old, after being released from the foster care system and going back with my mother, we revisited yet again dire poverty, struggle, mental illness, substance abuse, all the things that surrounded us. And the moment you stepped outside the house, graffiti, the gangbanging, all the things the dominant themes that shaped my life, it was only natural that I gravitated towards that life. And so my first arrest happened when I was 9 years old, walking into a grocery store, feeling the pains of hunger, but being a kid and thinking that meant I wanted candy. And interestingly, not having the money to get that candy. And I remember walking past the aisle over and over, eyeing that candy bar, and I remember grabbing it. And I remember cuffing it into my sleeve, And when I cuffed it into my sleeve, I got to the door, and lo and behold, before I could even take a step out, I remember someone grabbing me from behind, taking me to the back, searching me, finding a candy bar. And back then, they thought, well, we're going to scare him straight. We're going to call the police and come. And they're going to teach him a lesson. When the officers arrived, I remember them putting me in handcuffs. They took me to 35th and Low, a police station there in the south side of Chicago. I remember being cuffed to the wall, a long pole. I remember looking around the room, and I noticed the shotguns that were off to the side. I remember being intrigued by looking at real guns. And I'm sitting there, and I'm looking at this row of shotguns. I'll never forget, I just kept looking at them. No one was grabbing them or meddling with them. They were just there, like literally probably 8 or 9 feet away from me. And I remember that giving me, it only strengthened my curiosities about that. I knew that they were being antagonistic towards me, and I knew that other kids who had had this experience had described these things before. And I want you to know that that was my first arrest. By the time I was 10 and a half, I had accumulated several more. So understand, I kept seeing that same row of shotguns over and over again. And when I joined the gang at the age of 11 years old, I remember one of the guys saying, hey man, check this out. I said, what is that? Look, in the back of Ace's house, underneath the porch, that's where the guns are. If you have any problems, opposition comes, blah, 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 the guns are underneath his porch. When you tell that to a bunch of kids, it sparked our curiosity. Understand, for me at the age of 11 years old, I had yet to actually touch a real gun. My friend Little Man and Marlo and all the guys were like, man, let's go see the guns. Now remember, we're all 13, 12, 11, we're all kids. And I remember we went back to the back of Ace's house, we went to the back porch and we looked. And I remember us looking down, there was a black bag. And we had pulled this black bag out from underneath the porch amongst leaves and rocks and all those things. And it was wet, as it had been raining and it had yet to dry. I remember us moving the bag around and opening it up, and lo and behold, there were so many guns inside this bag. And as a child who had never seen actual and real guns, understand we were intrigued. And so I remember seeing one big, scary-looking gun, though I wouldn't dare to touch. But there was one small gun, well, relatively speaking, small. It was a .22 Smith & Wesson. It looked like the Yosemite Sam gun. Remember the one he spins? Right? So understand, in my mind, Yosemite Sam, And we all started laughing and joking, and I remember grabbing it. I remember playing with it. I remember my friend grabbed it, like, no, it's my turn. And then he grabbed it. And I understand you all, within this distance, we're standing here just playing with the gun, and all of a sudden, boom! And at the moment of hearing that sound, my consciousness warped in and out of slow motion and darkness. And what I didn't realize, you all, is that he had shot me in my face. So if you look beneath my left eye here, it's not a dimple. If you look right here, it's actually a gunshot. And when the bullet hit me, again, I had warped in and out of slow motion and darkness, and my friend grabbed me in terror, and he was crying. And when I realized what had just happened, he kept saying, I skinned you, I skinned you, I skinned you. He felt horrible about what happened, as you could imagine. Of course, he dropped the gun. My friends, the attention was towards me and trying to make sure I was okay. And I remember them pulling me to 3 houses down, carrying me, and through it all, unconscious, you all. And I felt a very burning sensation through my face, and yet my skin was numb. So understand, imagine feeling pain and numbness at the same time. It was a weird feeling. I literally thought I was dying, and I remember I kept saying, God, why me? I kept saying, God, why me? Why me, God, why? And I was saying this out loud, and that only added to the terror and horror of my friends, because they knew that what I meant. I thought I was dying, you all. I remember going to my other friend's house, and we went in. She grabbed a big giant towel, she put it to my face, and I was breathing profusely, and he kept saying, I skinned you, I skinned you. I looked into the mirror, and lo and behold, you all, when he moved the towel, it was like a fountain coming out of my face. And I just knew I was going to die. And as a child, I kept thinking to myself, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. And for me as a kid, what that meant was, swallow your blood. Swallow your blood. Because it was rushing down the back of my throat into my mouth. Instead of spitting it out, I just started swallowing my own blood. I started swallowing my own blood. And I thought that was my way of saving my own life. Little that I had no idea of how the body, in your mind, keep the blood. And interestingly, when the ambulance came, they put me in the back of the ambulance, and when they got me into the back of the ambulance, I'll never forget, a woman standing above me, one of the technicians with a giant needle. And I looked at her, and I was like, are you going to give me a shot? She said, Xavier, I already did. I already gave you a shot. It's going to hopefully take away some of your pain. And I looked, my skin was so numb, I didn't even feel that big needle in my face. And within moments, the officer came running to the ambulance, and he walked and he stood over me while I'm there, what could have been my deathbed. And he said, who shot you? It's the first thing he said, who shot you? Now understand, for me at that age, even at that age, my sense of loyalty to my friends, especially to even who was my best friend, of course I wasn't going to tell on my best friend. And I just came up with a story. I said, a man in a black a man in a black car. I'll just never forget thinking about, I just kept saying, a man in a black car, a man in a black car. I was probably thinking about the Knight Rider. You heard about the Knight Rider, y'all? You remember the Knight Rider? I just kept saying, it was a man. He kept asking me, describe him. I just kept saying, a man in a black car. And I remember getting to the hospital, being there in the emergency room, and I began to realize I may actually live. And I remember, just laying there and them, doing all the things that they would do to make sure I was okay. And it turns out that the bullet never actually entered into my skull. It caused bullet fragments to shatter and into my vision. I had what I felt was visibly a chicken jumping in my eye. A chicken jumping in my eye, like a fiery chicken. Meaning I couldn't see out of my eye anymore, but it was like a orange bright light just jumping in my eye. And I remember the officer coming and said, why did you lie to us? When the officer came back came to the hospital, he was like, why did you lie to us? I said, what do you mean? He said, you lied to us. Turns out that my other friend who was there, when he talked to the officer, he told the truth. And my friend shot my other friend by accident. It was an accident, officer. But that didn't matter. Because while all that was happening, understand, the story that I gave caused them to go out into the streets to pull over every black car, to question every person around, all the hard work and the narrative that they carried. Imagine if you thought an 11-year-old child shot in the face by a man in a black car, that would be horrifying. That would be so aggravating to think what man would do this to a poor 11-year-old child. Well, these officers were really storming the neighborhood trying to find out. When they got to the bottom of it, they were mad at me for lying. And so he said, don't worry about it. We'll connect again soon. And when he left, I didn't know what that meant. 2 weeks later, when my friend's being charged with attempted murder, and I'm still recovering physically, understand you all, I'm still recovering physically. I have a severely bruised face, a bloodshot eye. I could barely hear. I had lockjaw. I couldn't open my mouth because there was such trauma to my face that my mouth couldn't open. I was eating liquid like soft foods. And I remember the officer pulling up, the same officer pulling up on me 2 weeks later as I'm walking through my neighborhood. He said, "Come here, Speedy." And I looked at him and was like, "What's going on?" He said, "Come here." And he said, "Hop in the back." And I was like, "No, I'm not hopping in the back." I was actually tempted to run. And he jumped out, and I said, "Okay, I'm gonna hop in the back." Because I'd been whooped by these police. You know, understand, physical harm was the norm. And at every point of my experience growing up, whether it was a caretaker, whether it was a police officer, whether it was teachers, whether it was a rival gang member, physical harm was always a threat, a present threat throughout my childhood. And so when he jumped out of the car, I knew I could either resist and get whooped or just hop in. I hopped in. They ended up charging me with obstruction of justice. Understand, I'm 11 years old, you all. But when he said that out loud, I didn't even know what that meant. I'm like, obstruction of justice? What does that even mean? He said, "You lied to us." Now understand, I'm still physically vulnerable. And it's because of all of my previous arrests, you all, I didn't know that I'm not eligible to be detained at the detention center, at the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center. And I ended up there that evening. I remember going through intake, and at the bottom floor there in the hospital at the bottom, they're looking at my injuries, they're assessing if I can be there. Meaning, is he physically capable of being in this setting of detention? Do we need to separate him because of his vulnerability? And of course, me, at the age of 11 years old, I'm playing all the things in my head that I heard growing up. If you get locked up, you better be tough. If you get locked up, don't let no one, you know. So I'm coming in with this sense of like, I'm not going to be a victim in here. And they're saying, "Are you okay?" "Yes." "Are you able to this?" "Yes." "Yes, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay." I'm now in survival mode. And I remember there being an intake, and then the following morning being placed on section. Now I'm sharing this because I'm really also talking to somebody, I'm talking to the youth in this room, you all. So I want you to understand that I know what it means to be in these spaces. I know what it means to struggle, to navigate these things. And I remember the following morning being placed on section while all the kids were in school. And I remember going into the TV room. Understand, there's a TV room, a day room, and then there's a small bubble, and towards the back is the bathrooms. Other things I wasn't aware of, I was still figuring out the space. And I remember walking into the TV room, and I sat on the softest seat, right in front of the television, you all. Of course, that's your natural instinct. If you see a bunch of seats, you're gonna grab the softest, most comfortable seat in the room. And I remember sitting there, and as time went by, I'm observing the staff at the front. I'm seeing people come and go. And what I didn't realize is that within any moment, a flood of kids will be coming in from the school. And when they did that, I'm just watching, I'm searching, and my mind is, who's in my gang? Who are the opposition in here? I'm already assessing, because I need to survive in this space, to know who is who and what is what. And before I could even get even a visual of everybody in that space, a kid stood over me and said, "Get the fuck out my seat." He stood over me and said, "Get the fuck out of my seat." I'm sorry for profanity for the kids in here. I'm just being very real about my experience. I'm 11 years old, you all. Remember, I'm a gunshot victim. I'm recovering. I'm vulnerable. I've never been locked up before. I'm being charged with obstruction of justice. And understand from my perspective, what I'm hearing, what I'm sensing is, I'm locked up for my own fucking shooting. Think about that, you all. Like, I probably had the worst luck in the history of the juvenile justice system to be locked up from our own shooting. How do you get locked up for your own shooting? I'll tell you why in a little while. And so while this kid's standing above me, in my mind, I thought to myself, well, I'm going to do what they always say. If someone ever disrespects you, anyone ever tries to take something from you, you're either going to be a victim or you're going to be someone who stands up for himself and they're going to respect you no matter what. And I looked at this kid and man, he had muscles. It was a big kid. And I remember jumping up, you all. I remember jumping up real quick and swinging with all my might. I mean, that was my one, like that was my chance, right? And I remember jumping and swinging with all my might. And I remember connecting. And when I hit him, I'm like, there's no way in the hell someone can take that punch. And when I opened my eyes, he's still there. I'm like, damn. I'm assed out. When I tell you all, this kid beat the living daylights out of me. He knocked me into the television, and I remember the staff coming and breaking us up. And I remember them taking us to the back, and they put us in what I came to learn, what I didn't realize at the time, were the segregation rooms. Understand you all, I didn't even know what segregation was. These are my first experiences inside the system. I remember being thrown into that back room, the farthest cell on that wing towards the bathrooms, and the guy I fought was right next door to me. I'm in this small room. I'm looking inside this dingy mirror because it's all scratched up with gang graffiti. I'm trying to see how badly my scars out now. On top of the other injuries I already had, I have a busted lip and a busted nose, so I'm really going through hell physically. But my heart's racing, the adrenaline's pumping. I'm dealing with the fact that this is not going to be an easy ride. Whatever it is to come is not beginning well. These are just literally within hours of my experience there. And I remember thinking, okay, well, I got to get back out there. I'm going to get back out there. Understand, I didn't know what solitary confinement was. And when I thought that perhaps an adult would come and talk with me and find out what really happened, that didn't happen, you all. I remember being in that room and a piece of paper was slid underneath my door. And I looked, it was pink or green, it was very neon, I don't remember the color. But I remember looking at it and trying to read and understand what it said. And I remember it said 3-day, and then it said counselor. And then it said something about segregation or ICE, something like that. And I was like, what does that mean? And I remember the staff going back there and saying, you got toilet paper, you got blah, 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 asking me all these questions. I said, yeah. I said, when am I going to get out? He said, you're not going to get out. Understand you all, I'm 11 years old. I'm being told that I'm going to be confined to this small cell for at least 3 days straight, until someone comes and talks about what happens. And I don't know what's going to happen from there. I have no idea. Understand, I'm a child, you all. And it just brought me back to that place at the foster care home. I was locked away. That the best way to deal with me and my lack of structure or discipline is just to lock me away. Put him away. Who cares what happens to that kid in that cell? And I remember dealing with the isolation and realizing that I'm not going to get out of this place. And interesting, it didn't take long. I started hearing this crazy sound coming from the side of my cell. It was understand you all, I didn't know what that was. And so I got closer to the wall and I'm listening. I'm like, is that dude who just beat me up, banging on my wall? I'm like, we about to be going at it back here. I'm about to be dissing him and him dissing me. It's about to get, it's about to get crazy, And me, even though I got beat up, I'm like, what? I'm the one who got my butt whipped, but I ain't gonna be a punk, like, what? And I just expected some aggression. And I'm standing there and my heart's still pounding and I'm like afraid of this guy now, but I'm not gonna let him know that. And I remember stepping to the back, because there's like a sheet metal that lined the back of the cell, and I remember standing there, and I put my ear there, and he said, hey, I was like, what? He said, look down. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, look down, look towards the floor. And I looked down towards the floor, and he said, is the brick gone? And I looked, and sure enough, there was a part of I guess there was a 3-layered brick setup there, meaning like the wall had had been worked on, meaning someone who was so desperate in that cell began to work on the mortar of that small space in the back of the cell. And I remember thinking like, yeah, it is, some of it's gone. He said, me too. He said, listen, you work on your side, I'll work on my side, and we'll get this fucking brick out of here. And I'm like, for what? But little did I know, it was the culture. It was the culture of being in a place that was so desperate, that was so punitive for kids, that if you could just remove that brick, just remove those bricks right there, guess what? You could talk to somebody without having to yell. You can make eye contact. And I remember one of the kids running back to the cell, and I'm learning this in real time, and I remember one of the kids running back to my cell, and he threw a bunch of cards underneath my door. He wasn't supposed to do that. I came to find he was one of my guys. He was part of the gang that I was in. I didn't even know who he was, but he just gave me a bunch of cards. I could play solitary in there, right? I go playing solitary in isolated solitary confinement, you know. But I thought to myself, if I can get rid of that, we can get rid of that brick. We can play cards back here. And I'll tell you all we had a mission to do, because all we had was like a toothbrush and pens and some basic stationary things. And I remember we were working on that brick, hitting it, kicking it. And then when we hear the keys jingle, we know that means one of the staff are coming. I'm like, yo, stop. It took us about a day and a half. And lo and behold, we were able to get rid of that brick. We started playing cards together. We started talking. I got to know him. In fact, it was a GD from the South Side. We were rival gang members. It didn't matter. In that situation, it didn't matter. And interestingly, in that space, in that moment, our adolescence, really the deep soul-searching needs that we had as children, we had to find amongst ourselves. Because the adults didn't see that. They didn't know how excruciating painful it was to be in that space. Understand, you all, after that experience, going before the judge, and the judge giving us a stern lecture. This is 2 weeks later, you all. Me and my friend and him being lectured, they released him from the attempted murder charge. I said, Your Honor, it was an accident. They put us all on probation. Now they're going to keep a close and careful watch of you all now. And little did I know that my probation officer, Mr. Pollack, he wouldn't know what to do with me. Understand, and I feel bad for some adults who are trying to work with some of us, you know, especially back then, who came from serious trauma. We didn't have structure growing up. I was a gunshot victim. I was a child welfare child. I was all those things, and I feel bad for him looking back because he had a hard time. And you all, by the time I was 13 years old, I had 19 arrests and 7 convictions for armed robberies, aggravated assaults, weapon charges. And when I stood in front of the judge at the age of 13 years old, and when he told me I was incorrigible, because I was being charged with murder. I was a 13-year-old child who, unfortunately, at the time, I was a child welfare runaway.